Welcome to episode 9 of Reading to Mom. My name is Joe, the publisher at Historia Research near Printers Row in Chicago, Illinois. Chapter 8 is by far the most unusual in the work. It would never have seen the printed page if I had had complete editorial control at the time of publication. As the reading and video editing progressed during the tragic events unfolding in the past 2 weeks, I had to reconsider my original reaction and initial rejection of the subject matter. Perhaps, I must admit, our modern world, as our author disdainfully calls ours, has abandoned the high ideals of a seminal age of democracy and social justice in recent world history. Therefore, allow me to forego the customary aspersions so that I may introduce the author reading to his mother. Hi, Mom. Chapter 8 returns to the social history of the Provenance, specifically with respect to the Arcane people's understanding of equality and liberty. I don't recollect what I had in mind when I first wrote these words nearly a decade ago, but as I reread them to you, I could not help but think of the historic events from the late American Republic, initiated by the inhumane and depraved murder of George Floyd, captured in a video recording lasting 8 minutes and 46 seconds. A major theme of the chapter is that the loftiest principles of democracy originated and developed in the great cities from world history. This isn't to say that the cities were flawless, or that the cities did not give us problems of their own, such as police brutality and one of, if not the, most odious president from the short history of the United States of America. But the righteous citizens of cities, time and time again, have reminded us of the necessity for vigilance and collective action to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and for posterity. A contemporary author from the late American Republic presciently observed, nearly 1 year before the protest and social movement galvanized by George Floyd's death, without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different. It might not be a democracy at all. So, while Chapter 8 may be a digression from Sidra's story, it's my hope that it serves as an example that the Arcane peoples have given to modern times, and that readers will come to understand that many people of the Provenance would have readily accepted the notion that Chapter 8, The Coin and the Sum, Two Forces of Reciprocity. As the story of the merchant's purchase of the administrative building suggests, the political life of the Provenance often took unexpected turns that seemed to undermine the social well-being of its people. Despite the immediate and idealistic fervor for the public good that every citizen claimed as the most sacred duty of self-governance, in practice, a culture as variegated as the Provenance never settled on a standard definition. Hence, democratic politics unavoidably introduced from time to time, bad legislation that failed to promote the Commonwealth. In some instances, it was possible to attribute such enactments to the subterfuge of rogues. Footnote 1.
The trade of rogues.
This was in fact Sidra's judgment when she first learned of the merchant's purchase of the public house at the Acropolis. Rogues earned their unique place in the Provenance based on unfounded blasphemies as much as, if not more so than, their self-serving actions. Those who loved the law of the Provenance gained a certain comfort in the idea that the ill will, or toisisfreen, of rogues misled the people at times. For this reason, as well, the councils tolerated, even welcomed, the rogues of Tityos who resettled in Naxos and Panoptes to join the politics of the Provenance soon after the conclusion of the Glorious Revolution. Routinely, council apprentices like Sidra learned the popular adage,
"New laws must e'er rectify the trade of rogues."
With such easy targets to scapegoat, the arcane peoples more easily neglected the consideration that fundamental flaws in their society, or more pernicious influences, undermined the Provenance. End footnote. In some instances, it was possible to attribute such enactments to the subterfuge of rogues. But more often than not, the experiment in self-government failed to keep pace with the progressive material and social conditions of the Arcane Age. Consequently, by the late Arcane Age, the customs of the provenantial peoples may have served to perpetuate democracy and foster social well-being more than circumstance and law combined. In general, social customs stimulated a powerful identification with concerted action and reciprocity, or the mutual privileges secured from common cause. As discussed earlier, each of the three interests spurred their own peculiar confederations, guilds, associations, and cartels. The Provenance's councils as well embody the basic will to assemble in a republic that provides historical context for this narrative. Indeed, the grounds for affiliations mold the contours of any social history, and certainly no less so in the Provenance than in our modern nation-states. More profoundly, it then must be said, the arcane peoples of the Provenance derived greater benefits from reciprocity than any other society or period in world history. Seemingly, there was no object that the peoples of the Provenance despaired of obtaining if pursued through the cooperative movement directed by a union. While the councils and the three interests, after many centuries, perdured as if impelled by the collective will of the age, it was the associations that originated and grew from the initiative of individuals that truly distinguishes the period and the people. While literally hundreds of associations promoted nearly every political or social objective the councils considered, two types of arcane reciprocity in particular shaped the events in which Sidra took part: the koinonia, the commoners' associations to foster the traditions of the statements of principles, and the sumenuni, the small bands of arcanists that joined forces to achieve a specific purpose. The commoners formed associations to unite like-minded individuals in concerted action to promote an interest or an opinion. Frequently gathered in conventions, these associations operated as distinct political entities that functioned like virtual governments in the Provenance. The oldest and most successful of these types of reciprocity, koinonia, or the coin for short, encompassed 6 different associations that defended and promoted the statements of principles that originated in the time of the godheads and their preternatural cities. Generally, a term meaning communion or fellowship, as well as common gift or contribution, the citizens of the Provenance knew the coin collectively as the noble societies. Although the name implies that the nobles combined to influence the politics and social life of the Provenance, none of the 6 factions allied or federated into a larger organization to represent nobility. Rather, each noble society separately fostered knowledge, circulated scrolls, and joined in rituals that defined the society's distinct political and intellectual positions on the most important subjects of the era. In part, the citizens of the Provenance regarded the coin as noble societies due to the origins of the associations. In the early years of the Provenance, following the end of the Glorious Revolution, the reader may recall, most nobles found themselves displaced from the cities conquered by the dragons. Forced to relocate to Naxos and Panoptes, where the strange new experiment in self-governance originated, and still despised for their roles in the city-states of the godheads, the nobles who failed to discover any innate abilities in the classical powers struggled to secure meaningful work in the new government and agencies of the councils. Footnote 2. The noble societies numbered only 6 rather than 7, since none of the nobles of Tityos escaped the wrath or the lure of the sorcerer. For this reason, it was the despised rogues in secret society who carried on the traditions of Tityos for the millennium. In one of the common ironies of historical events, Alcyonians formed a noble society, despite the fact that the city never suffered the establishment of a noble class in the desert city of mutuality during the preternatural age. Unsurprisingly, the Alcyonian noble society adopted the most democratic rules of reciprocity and the most inclusive criteria for membership. And footnote. Forced to relocate to Naxos and Panoptes, where the strange new experiment in self-governance originated, and still despised for their roles in the city-states of the godheads, the nobles, who failed to discover any innate abilities in their classical powers, struggled to secure meaningful work in the new government and agencies of the councils. More vexing to those with a taste for nobility, law required the bureaucrats who managed the machinery of government to reside in the common quarters of the Acropolis. In the earliest years following the revolution against the godheads, the councils decreed that
the government and administration of the province, being collectively the property of the people, so shall it be that no persons shall make administrative palaces of the province their permanent homes.
Footnote 3. Noros, the first laws of the province, stanza 137. Nolos regarded this particular law to be the single most significant act of the province for the preservation of the Inchoate democracy. In early times, the nobles established their homes in the administrative palaces of the godheads, a practice that made clear that their power extended from the will of the godheads. In the Arcane Age, the bureaucrats of the councils walked daily from their homes to the administration buildings and vacated the buildings each night. The law permitted none to claim an essential place in the governance of the province. End footnote. The act forced the last noble families that survived the glorious revolution to settle among the commoners on whose behalf they administered government. In response to the assault on their former stature, the untalented descendants of the nobles took it upon themselves to preserve the ethical codes of the preternatural cities. Undoubtedly, the organizers endeavored to secure a legacy that dignified their ancestors' participation in the brutality of the godheads' estates. The new societies argued that it was not despotism that formed the earliest cities of the domain, but the shared ethical and intellectual habits of thought first coined in the 7 communities of the godheads. One of the few recovered tracts from the noble society of Naxos claimed,
Ideals, not fear, erected authority, and enthroned the preternatural godheads.
acceding to the relevance of self-governance in a new age, the noble societies nevertheless put forth the idea that the virtues that make people free arose directly from the social conditions of the cities.
The mighty political principles which govern the province today, without doubt, first began and developed in the cities.
Footnote 4. Cities in the plural, as the Canonia of Alcyonius meant the original cities of the godheads collectively. From Statement of Principles by the Noble Society of Alcyonius, from Panoptes, around the first epoch, 5th period of the Arcane Age. End footnote. Initially then, the noble societies were indeed aristocratic bodies that claimed to carry on a legacy that their families passed down to later generations. Their loyalties were misplaced, their aspirations wed to the ideals of a despotic age and motivated by self-interest. The nobles' argument that something much deeper than law and circumstance perpetuates despotic societies, such as the Godhead cities over incalculable eons, nonetheless warranted merit. The hegemony of a political and economic order reproduces itself from the ethical and intellectual habits of thought in the populace at large. Those habits of thought form the basis for customs and values that are passed down generation to generation like a family's jewels. Customs somehow both more ephemeral and more solid than gems. In other words, the nobles claimed the commoners were complicit in their servility, or self-tutelage. In the end, as in the Glorious Revolution, the nobility won the early battles but lost the war. Over the course of the Arcane Age, the noble societies evolved into learned communities that explored the major social questions of the day in order to discover the best arguments to win the support of civic majorities in legislative and judicial matters. Divided as the Provenance was between 7 different ethical and social codes that traced their origins to 7 disparate cities of the preternatural age, no majority was ever attainable when stated in the logic of a single statement of principles. To shape public opinion, a noble society for one statement of principles had to familiarize itself with the ethical and social code of other statements in order to craft arguments that appealed beyond one association or coin. Consequently, noble societies soon became the leading centers of discourse on the ethical systems of the arcane world. By Sidra's lifetime, the nobility of the societies derived more from the dignity and erudition of the scholarly work produced by the coin rather than from the aristocracy of their ancestors. In a nutshell, democracy transformed the noble societies as much as the societies transformed every level of the personal and social lives of the arcane peoples. For in fact, by the end of the Arcane Age, the statements of principles ceased to be transmitted as a set of codes that adherents simply followed, like the commandments of a godhead. The Provenance, like the spirit of his people, proved to be too vast and too complex to be organized by a tidy list of prohibitions or commandments more suitable to a despotic age. Likewise, simple distinctions between good and evil became untenable after the godheads lost the power to terrorize the common sense of the people. The peoples of the Provenance gradually forgot that the statements of principles derived from the preternatural cities and ethical codes designed by the godheads to perpetuate their stranglehold on power. The Arcane Age thoroughly reconfigured the concept and practice of principled action to support a new democratic order. In their final form, the statements of principles became shorthand for describing the attitudes toward and support for the public good of the Provenance. Centuries after the end of the preternatural age, all of the noble societies held in common a clear and distinct idea about the differences between the despotism of the godheads and the democracy of the Provenance. Whereas the despotic godheads ruled in order to benefit the fewest number of their citizens necessary to secure the reproduction of despotism, the coin argued that the councils of the Provenance endeavored to benefit the greatest possible number of people to cultivate the boundless rewards of self-governance. The formula inevitably raised questions about what most benefited the people and how effectively the council served the public good. Specifically, this meant personal attitudes towards social well-being and toward the law largely shaped how the peoples of the Provenance associated in the noble societies and interacted with one another in the larger social world. The coin articulated 6 different dispositions toward the public good of the Provenance, while rogues harbored in secrecy the principles of Titios. No wonder that Sidra's record, as in her account of Oron's remarks as she entered the gate, often seem equivocal due to certain subtleties in the different dispositions of the characters at the Acropolis. With respect to the social well-being of the people, the noble societies divided equally between those factions that regarded social well-being of the people as the highest aim of the councils, and those factions that held that the cultivation of individuality as an equal or primary objective. In simple terms, this meant that the noble society split into factions that supported equality over liberty, social well-being or common weal, and factions that supported liberty over equality, individuation. Few disputants went so far as to deny the validity of the other, with the exception of the rogues' pointed sarcasm. The question largely turned on whether, or when, social well-being or individuation represented the public good, and how best to govern the other as a practicable means to that end. In both cases, then, few council members were motivated to promote interests that favored the formation of a rigid social order, and in this regard, all 6 noble societies stayed true to the highest ideals of the Provenance. With respect to law, opinion varied in more subtle ways. The noble societies divided along 3 lines in terms of how well the law benefited the greatest number of citizens. On the one side, the citizens of Alcyonius, Panoptes, and Pallene sided with those that judged the law in a self-governed society as the most efficacious instrument to enhance the public good for the largest number of citizens. In opposition, the Naxians, the descendants of Panthema, and the Agrinians, the sacred city of wanderers, tended to look on the law of the councils as a limited means to achieve the public good. In opposition, the Naxians, the descendants of Panthema, and the Agrinians, the sacred city of wanderers, tended to look on the law of the councils as a limited means to achieve the public good. Lastly, dividing the absolutism of the two main factions, the Libuans and Acropolitans held that the law was an ambiguous tool for the promotion of the public good, largely insufficient in and of itself. The Arcane's use of words, however, revealed distinct habits of thoughts in regard to the common feel and the propensity for law-making. Textual analytics of extant records segmented by the document's city of origin and the author's mastery of classical powers reveal the relative commitments of the provenantial coin to the principles of social well-being and individuation, as well as the effectiveness of law in support of their principle for the public good. See Illustration 7. Illustration 7. Cultural map of the provenantial coin. A conceptual map of arcane ideologies differentiated by favor for social well-being against individuation, the vertical axis, and attitude toward the effectiveness of law to achieve the public good, the horizontal axis. The populations at the top of the map exhibit the most favor for social well-being as the public good, while those near to the bottom exhibit more favor for individuation as the public good. Likewise, the populations furthest to the left regard law as an effective means to achieve the public good, while the populations furthest to the right regard law as an ineffective means to achieve the public good. The central tendency of the city populace is marked by the innermost dot, while the size of the surrounding circle indicates the population's size. The deviation of the arcane philosophy most closely related to each city is measured by the bar connecting the two interests of provenantial society. Textual analytics of extant records segmented by the document's city of origin and the author's mastery of classical powers reveal the relative commitments of the provenantial coin to the principles of social well-being and individuation, as well as the effectiveness of law in support of either principle for the public good. While most citizens of the province favored social well-being as much as or more than individuation, the city populations largely represented different nodes of political thought that balanced out the regard for law as an effective or ineffective instrument of the public good. Additionally, with the exception of the wizards and the rogues, the arcanists represented by the High Council demonstrated more respect for law than the commoners of the city associated with each classical power. For their part, the arcanists ardently committed to the experiment and self-governance in the province. The two clear exceptions to public spiritedness were clearly the Acropolitans and the rogues. Strictly speaking, the rogues originated in Titios, the lost city of the preternatural age, and may have exhibited the anarchic tendencies of the former population of the most western city of the domain. The Acropolis, however, seemingly attracted the most adventurous types from other communities in the domain and formed a civic population unlike any other in the province. Ambivalence for the law and social well-being, as exemplified by the Acropolitans and rogues, did not always vex the provenance. In the early epochal primes of the Arcane Age, adherents of provenantial law dominated the councils and politics of the cities. While the nobles resurrected the preternatural principles of a bygone age, the commoners of the province largely adopted the set of principles that advanced their own power and interest in the political order, regarding the work of nobles as largely anathema to the interests of the people. For these reasons, despite the fact that the love of law and social well-being resounded most strongly in Alcyonius, the least populated of the seven cities, the citizens of Panoptes and Naxos rejected their noble society's indifference or doubts for the common weal or the public good. Similarly, the surviving commoners from the western cities, once conquered by the sorcerer of Titios, typically privileged individuation over social well-being as a protection against the despotism of law, rather than as a rejection of lawfulness. against the despotism of law rather than as a rejection of lawfulness. Lastly, further reinforcing the staunch advocacy of the public good in the early Arcane Age, the paladins who hailed from Alcyoneus frequently worked directly for the councils and executed the laws of the Provenance in the spirit of the common weal. Footnote 5. Most paladins thought the idea of campaigning without the imprimatur of the councils of the Provenance unfathomable. In fact, as one of the peculiarities of this arcane philosophy, paladins lost the ability to employ their classical power if they failed to uphold love of law and love of social well-being in their acts and words. It was as if the power of paladins derived directly from communion with the public good of the Provenance. See Bauhaus, Race, Language, and Culture, pages 127 to 131. End footnote. Lastly, further reinforcing the staunch advocacy for the public good in the early Arcane Age, the paladins, who hailed from Alcyoneus, frequently worked directly for the councils and executed the laws of the Provenance in the spirit of the common weal. From out of these circumstances, customs took shape that entrenched respect for the public good long after material conditions first threatened to subvert the social fiber of the Provenance and the spirit of the Arcane Age. The guiding principles of the Provenance in its earliest epochal primes thus reflected a society in which political concerns and rhetoric preoccupied life. Footnote 6. To the extent that the entertainment industry preoccupies the life of the modern world. End footnote. The guiding principles of the Provenance in its earliest epochal primes thus reflected a society in which political concerns and rhetoric preoccupied life. Conscious that they were the first self-governing society to oppose both godheads and despots in the domain, the citizens of the Provenance regarded the work of the councils as their most important business, and, in a fashion, indulged in political talk as if the greatest pleasures derived from discourse. Unchained from the despotism and worship of the godheads, the earliest citizens of the Provenance rarely discovered inherent conflicts between law and social well-being. The social customs that formed in support of the public good in the early centuries served to explain, more than any circumstance, the increasing extension of political rights to the least powerful and most wealthy persons in the Provenance. These customs explain as well why the councils worked so diligently to manage the arable estates of the recovered western cities with great care and efficiency. Most citizens avidly defended the public good as the only means to secure the fruits of their individual labors in the western territories. By the end of the Arcane Age, however, opinions became more refined, and many of the citizenry judged the law an insufficient means to secure the public good, whether by that the coin intended social well-being or individuality. Footnote 7. This is not to say that the citizens of the Provenance rejected self-governance in the law at the end of the Arcane Age. It is merely to say that increasing numbers of citizens, perhaps erroneously, came to believe that extra legal forces contributed to the common weal. The rogues alone decried the law and self-governance as an inefficient means to any end. Of course, as libertines, the rogues cared even less for social well-being. End footnote. By the end of the Arcane Age, however, opinions became more refined, and many of the citizenry judged the law an insufficient means to secure the public good, whether by that the coin intended social well-being or individuality. In short, divisions formed from the historical conflicts and political necessities of self-governance that reinforced the transmission of customs and habits of thought. As the diversity of cultures in the Provenance grew, many of the greatest thinkers in the coin came to see how the principle of equality before the law rarely adhered to the ideal in practice without vigilant oversight. During the first few epochal primes of the Arcane Age, the councils learned that the people constantly changed in both number and character with the passing of generations and the reacquisition of the lost cities. Despite the original intent of the councils, A law easily morphed into harmful legislation as the social conditions of the province advanced. As a result, the councils often judged the laws of the province defective, the very laws that previous councils legislated in the interest of the public good, and modified prior legislation with greater and greater frequency. In time, both the Arcane and Common Councils cultivated among the council members the idea that lawmaking was the tireless perfection of the law to correct the mistakes and myopia of ancestral lawmakers' original intentions. Thus, while the law came to be regarded as inevitably flawed, even by the paladins who never questioned the need to exercise and follow the laws as written, the esteem for lawmaking, if only to undo bad legislation, continued to dominate the political life of the province. This political environment created a ripe opportunity for the coin to make a case for their relevance in the new democratic order and contribute to the intellectual and ethical advances of the province. The Koinonia of Naxos first circulated scrolls inscribed with recommendations to the councils on the positions that council members should take on legislation before them. The Koinonia of Panoptes, seeing an opportunity to reach a wider audience, produced scrolls that recorded exemplary acts of individuals who adhered to their principles. In a fashion, a book of moral stories for the masses. The Koinonia of Alcyonius, at that time the most highly regarded noble society, first formed lyceums at which the commoners organized teach-ins and community study groups to better understand the nuances of democratic legislation and the public good. Dedicated to the expansion of social well-being, these three koinonia adopted each other's tactics and became prolific centers of public scholarship on the significant political, social, and ethical issues of the day. The other three koinonia, dedicated to the cultivation of individuality, focused their efforts on the development of practices and trials that expanded the boundaries of the regard for the self. The koinonia of Pallene, believing it had hit upon a critical notion for the cultivation of individuality, first abolished its commandments and the rote memorization of preternatural law. The koinonia of Agrinio, advocating frequent commune with the sacred world as the true means to define one's individuality, led 23-day expeditions into the North Lyman that pushed trekkers to the limits of hunger and personal despair. And lastly, the koinonia of Libua, after a failed experiment with the promotion of temperance, began organizing dropouts, at which participants ingested powerful druidic reagents that caused even the dullest commoners to witness visions and explore the depths of their consciousness. Footnote 8. As we can well imagine today, the koinonia of Libua, which was indifferent to both law and social well-being, grew to become one of the largest and most volatile factions of the province. Driven by the desire to expand their minds and press the limits of self-exploration as the best means to uncover what it all means, the adherents of the Libuan statements of principles evolved into a form of mysticism that popularized the cult of the self in the domain. Rather than studying the social world to understand the formation of individuality, tragically, the koinonia of Libua proposed to peel away the layers of personhood, as if like an onion, in hopes of discovering some eternal kernel or soul stuff at the core of individuality. For a more detailed comparison of the coin, see Bios, Race, Language, and Culture, pages 151 to 167. End footnote. And lastly, the koinonia of Libua, after a failed experiment with the promotion of temperance, began organizing dropouts at which participants ingested powerful druidic agents that caused even the dullest commoners to witness visions and explore the depths of their consciousness. While differing in their approaches, together, these three koinonia encouraged the peoples of the province to care for individuation as a boundary for the inherent social control accorded to law, nature, and consciousness. Footnote 9. For the most part, Followers of the three individualistic koinonia gravitated to the western cities. The denizens of Panoptes and Naxos remained staunchly committed to the objective of social well-being for the greatest number. In general, the wizards, clerics, and eastern commoners never seemingly conceived of opposing the laws of the councils. As the original cities of the Federation, and for several epochal primes, the majority of the peoples of the Providence, the two cities created a stabilizing force for the Republic. For instance, though no city ever sought to secede from the Providence, the leaders of Paline once claimed the right to nullify a law of the councils. While the details are not recorded, the citizens of Panoptes and Naxos, who previously relocated to Paline to start a new life, organized marches and protests that brought to an end the usurpations of the Paline dwarves before the nullification crisis provoked civil war between the three cities. Nolos, First Laws of the Providence, stanzas 313 to 317. End footnote. By the end of the Arcane Age, the coin brought together like-minded commoners and arcanists into studies and discussions of their personal inclinations and motivations. Notably, the coin became one of the Republican sites, aside from alehouses and herb markets, where commoners and arcanists combined on equal terms. Most often, the commoners rose to positions of nobility in these associations because they alone had the time and personal inclinations to obtain broad knowledge of the competing statements of principles and to influence the adherents of other koinonia. Both commoners and arcanists sought counsel from the noble leaders of the coin when presented with personal or public quandaries that required deliberations. In this respect, the coin came to exercise a powerful hold over the private and public matters of the peoples of the Provenance. A world ruled by the consciousness of hundreds of thousands of individuals, joined merely by the commonsensical instinct for self-governance, may present itself to the modern reader as somehow more determinate and more ambiguous at the same time. More determinate in that the peoples of the Provenance enthusiastically envisioned a world in which both personal and social perfection seemed within reach. Footnote 10. On this account, we must quote Hervé Sonville-Coquet's Democracy in the Provenance. Equality did not invent the idea of the perfectibility of person and society. The Godheads first proposed the perfection of their own persons and set in place religious beliefs that perfected the servility of the people to the Godheads. Equality gave perfectibility a new quality when it stripped the distinction of class, birth, and profession from the social world of the Provenance. As class distinctions disappeared, as a tumultuous mass of the domain altered practices, customs, and laws, uncovered new facts, discovered new truths, extinguished ancient and unfounded prejudices, the vision of perfection imprinted itself steadfastly in the arcane mind. End footnote. More determinate in that the peoples of the Providence enthusiastically envisioned a world in which both personal and social perfection seemed within reach. Rarely in the pages of Sidra's journals do we find a person who expressed the kind of apathy or powerlessness that pervades the apprehension and hopelessness of the modern mind. And yet, the arcane world divided into 1,000 forms, brittle from the choices and schisms that the responsibility for self-government places on a people. As a bizarre residual of their penchant for reciprocity, the peoples of the Provenance appeared to associate to an extent that separatism, more than association, ruled the era. Torn by allegiances to specific classical powers, the three interests, and the various statements of principles, not to mention the myriad of personal and provincial politics peculiar to each of the cities, the ambiguity of opinions and deeds raised formidable barriers to the pursuit of the public good in law and in the Provenance at large. Extraordinarily, the people of the Provenance understood the fragility of their arcane social order. the fragility of their arcane social order, and coined a word to describe the combination of contrary forces into vital reciprocity. Sumanuni. To be certain, the word first appears in Agrigentum's tome on the nature and combination of the four elements. Her usage of the term has been variously translated as to mix together, commingle, join forces, adding in, and to be combined. In all instances, the translators, including this translator, follow closely Agrigentum's theory of the four elements, in which she described the prime substances as immutable and indivisible.
Elements equal. Each holds its own station, discloses its prime nature, undivided. Nothing adds to them, nothing passes away. Neither empty nor full, unbound nor fettered, elements prevail, whilst melodies unfold.
Neither alike nor contrary, the elements commingle in a manner that does not blend or transmute the original substances, but produces relations, melodies, that transcend and unleash the forces of the classical powers, a decidedly different form of reciprocity than that conceived by the coin and similar societies. Footnote 11. In Agrigentum's usage, arcanists commingled changeless elements together, in order to produce, in moments of discordance, the stunning forces and special effects of the classical powers. Similarly, the Sumanumi mixed together the arcane philosophies to achieve a specific lasting purpose of concordance. End footnote. Neither alike nor contrary, the elements commingle in a manner that does not blend or transmute the original substances, but produces relations, melodies, that transcend and unleash the forces of the classical powers, a decidedly different form of reciprocity than that conceived by the coin and similar societies. Occasionally, a fragment from a document discovered in an arcane archive, unearthed by an archaeological dig, also employs the word to describe the basis of the Provenance's political or social order. The aphorism commemorating the federation between Panoptes and Naxos in the midst of the Glorious Revolution features a variant of the word to express the joining of forces.
We join with heart, hand, and head, the Provenance.
Footnote 12. Interestingly, the syntax of the aphorism leaves room for a different rendering of the arcane text.
We join heart, hand, and head in the Provenance.
This translation of the aphorism indicates that the passions, the body, and the mind, heart, hand, and head, commingle to form the Provenance. If this is the proper translation of the aphorism, and I am less skeptical of the argument than I once was, then the meaning of the axiom reflects the synergy between individuality and society that the arcane people sought to perfect. In the joining of heart, hand, and head, a person becomes, in a sense, complete in symmetry, ruled by the passions, bodily urges, and rationality to a complementary degree. And in the joining to shape the complete individual, the transcendent world of the Provenance, the perfectible social order, comes into being. Abstruse, to say the least, but an eminently fantastic vision for the future. End footnote. The aphorism commemorating the federation between Panoptes and Naxos in the midst of the Glorious Revolution features a variant of the word to express the joining of forces. We join with heart, hand, and head, the Provenance. While no extant fragment records the reasoning behind the wizard's division of the provincial government into the High Council and the People's Council, the logic of combining the elements of the social order together, arcanists and commoners, like elements of the classical powers, is evident in the wizard's constitution, and explicitly when the citizens of the Provenance mixed together and took shape in the logos of the cities. The term used to describe how the people combined was again sumenume. The lens provided through each of these examples illustrates the degree to which the concept of sumenume, the mixing together of dissimilar and unique forces, was the keystone in the cosmology and social architecture of the Arcane Age. Nonetheless, while sum, the colloquial short form of the word, became a keyword for many phenomena in the Arcane Age, the term most often referred to the combination of arcanists into small bands of adventurers, like Sidra's envoy to the kobolds. These small parties present a window through which we learn about the larger significance of the concept of mixing together, and the arcane mind in general. For, in fact, the philosophers of the Arcane Age ordered their small associations as the rationale of the classical powers suggested, and developed certain types of ritualistic practices that they believed augmented the combined force of their small bands to the fullest. Thus, the sum of arcanists speaks to the many forms of mixing together, including the architectural array of the pentagonal sections of the Acropolis in a way that signified the autonomy and harmony of the separate interests that the arcane peoples of the Provenance invented and pursued. Thus, the sum of arcanists speaks to the many forms of mixing together that the arcane peoples of the Provenance invented and pursued. Although Oron selected the first members of Sidra's envoy, her band of arcanists illustrates the basic features of a sum. Foremost among the characteristics of the reciprocity formed by philosophers, the alliances took shape with a clearly defined purpose. The objectives of the sum may be concise and simple, such as petitioning the leader of the kobolds to release an imprisoned merchant, or open-ended and complex, such as investigating the disappearance or whereabouts of a missing merchant. In most instances, as well, there was little need for continuous association, and the vast majority of arcanists allied with two or more groups at a time. While this practice ran the risk of dividing loyalties, the arcane philosophers tacitly accepted the difficulties of concerted effort, with the understanding that a union always accomplished far more than an individual. Lastly, although the purpose for a combination of arcanists changed as circumstances warranted, when a band fulfilled the original quest which brought them together, and no other purposeful avenues suggested a reason to hold the band together, the individuals nearly always went their separate ways. Footnote 13. Then as now, in certain cases, a corporation of mercenaries mixed together for no other purpose than to loot as much booty as may be had in a lifetime. Such bands, of course, operating under the vague goal of wealth accumulation, may be long-lasting provided that the members survive the frequent forays into the alignment. Yet, in the Arcane Age, few arcanists seem to covet wealth to the extent that it is coveted today, and only a small percentage of all arcanists incorporated for the sole purpose of pillaging. End footnote. Little wonder, then, that Sidra noted in her journal, following her return to the Acropolis,
"The malicious actions of the orc and the disappearance of the merchant may be a gift, in that my fellows and I, now join forces with more purpose."
An equally important feature, the action of sum nearly always brought together a variety of classical powers. Only rarely a band of arcanists associated two persons with abilities from the same classical power. In an obvious way, the concept of mixing together, in Agrigentum's work and in the bands of arcanists, necessarily suggests the combination of the different elements and the separate classical powers in order to unleash the reciprocal and transcendent forces of these unions. Nevertheless, the practice evolved into an unspoken custom due to the perceived psychic benefits to the members. For in contrast to the associations of commoners joined in like-mindedness, the arcanists derived a compelling sense of individuality from their unique contributions to the combined potency of the association, or fellowship. Sidra's exchange with Zora Dermik along the Wayfarer's Trail exemplifies the paradoxical rewards of individuality and potency that arcanists derive from their joint efforts. Alone, Sidra's powers to heal and Dermic's fighting prowess achieved very little, soon placing both in peril. In combination, the tandem survived in good physical health to defend the travelers between the cities. Footnote 14. We must take care, however, not to overstate the power of reciprocity to nourish the Arcanist's sense of purposefulness, individuality, and potency. As Sidra noted, the impression among fighters who concluded that they were nothing more than clerics' oft-smitten puppets indicates a certain delicacy in the joining of the classical powers. Reduced to an extension of the clerical abilities, like an animated skeleton, it's little wonder that many fighters retired to the fields long before their abilities began to deteriorate. From a cleric's perspective, like Sidra's as she entered Libua, the power to return a person from the threshold of mortality often created a cryptic distance between the healer and the healed. In both cases, we see how individuality may lead to alienation from our closest comrades. See Brew, Naxian Ethic, pages 149 to 151. End footnote. Alone, Sidra's powers to heal and Dermic's fighting prowess achieved very little, soon placing both in peril. In combination, the tandem survived in good physical health to defend the travelers between the cities. Facilitating the custom to combine unique classical powers into one band, Arcanists typically joined forces in numbers equal to one of the four elemental primes: 2, 3, 5, and 7. The smaller bands of 2 or 3 persons often formed to serve as emissaries, like the druids who traveled in pairs between the cities to deliver messages, or to achieve some covert goal while avoiding outright conflict. For tactical missions that likely entailed combat, such as Sidra's envoy to the Koboloi, the bands often numbered 5 or 7 Arcanists. Whatever the case, the number of Arcanists seemed to follow a particular rationale for the arcane mind. Footnote 15. One explanation, popularized by televised history programs, it must be noted, attributes the strict limitations in the size of Arcanist bands to Agrigentum. The small bands, the argument goes, were less likely to result in a force that undermined the social democracy of the Provenance. While compelling as a dramatized documentary, none of the extant fragments of Agrigentum's treatise on nature supports the assertion, and the wizards of Agrigentum who drafted the laws of the Provenance left no evidence of the connection. The underlying scholarship, in this regard, has not yet reached sufficient quality to warrant a citation. End of footnote. Whatever the case, the number of the Arcanists seemed to follow a particular rationale for the arcane mind. In general, the philosophers of the classical powers deemed a band of 7 the most balanced and potent force. As the prime of anime, the number 7 simply suggested life to the arcane mind. In addition, if a member of the 7-member band of Arcanist adventurers fell, a 6th member often stepped aside to reform a 5-member band. In this manner, the 7-member band possessed symbolic value as the primal nature of the classical powers, and permitted practical flexibility in the event of a loss. Most frequently, however, as with Sidra's original Sum, the associations among Arcanists numbered 5. The several statements of principles that divided the councils of the Provenance into factions also divided the Sum of the Arcanists. Seemingly, the classical powers favored none of the principles, and the arcane philosophers, with the exception of paladins and rogues, practiced the principles they learned in their youth or taught themselves in adulthood. Rarely did a band of Arcanists share the same statement of principles. Footnote 16. A few arcane documents that survive today describe the deeds of a band of Arcanists who followed a single statement of principles. In each case, it seems, the purpose of the Sum sought in some way to advance one or more of the statements of principles guiding the coin. As soon as the objective was achieved, the group disbanded like all others. Though inconclusive due to the scarcity of records, a unity of principles seemed to restrict, not augment, the combined powers of Arcanists. End footnote. Rarely did a band of Arcanists share the same statement of principles. Driven by the ethic that word and deed should serve the public good of the Provenance, The division in principles among individuals presented any combination of the classical powers with an uncertainty in how best to uphold the public good. Compounded by further divisions, such as the differences among the cultures of the Provenance, the reciprocity of assume demanded concentration and direction from one or more of its members. Nonetheless, it seems, the art of leadership was not a prerequisite for the ability to engage the classical powers, and groups larger than 5 members often proved to be too intractable for most arcanists. Footnote 17. In this regard, Sidra's frequent notes about the tenuousness of her leadership and her recurring conflicts with the rogue, Eosh, demonstrate the great difficulty in mixing together 5 arcanists. In part, the diligence with which Sidra, recorded the details of her conversations reflects the quality of her leadership. The copious records evidence Sidra's effort to understand the principles that may divide the Sum of her party. End footnote. Nonetheless, it seems, the art of leadership was not a prerequisite for the ability to engage the classical powers, and groups larger than 5 members often prove to be too intractable for most arcanists. These considerations and limitations determine the basic features for a band of arcanists that even today remains popular in the imagery of the adventuring party associated with a purpose, diversified in abilities, composed of unique individuals, limited in number to symbolically represent one of the primal substances of nature, and consumed by personal disputes and resolutions. At the same time, the arcanist bands that, to this day, entertain the modern imagination, merely manifest the best traits of the peoples of the Domain and the Arcane Age. It may be said that the philosophers of the classical powers shamelessly imitated the democratic bent of the people. Their unity in the public good, their dedication to individuality and distinction, their specialization in a variety of labors and professions, their distribution of wealth, and their mixing together to debate and self-govern. In effect, the Sums of the Arcanists, the fellowships of many fantastical historical narratives, merely formed microcosms of the self-governing commoners who constituted the macrocosm of the Arcane Age. The savvy consumer of arcane histories hesitates when confronted by the character of the arcane world as it truly was. The typical representation of arcane societies paints the picture of a world oppressed by despotic or monarchical governments, as if after the deposing of the godheads, smaller fiefdoms ruled by more petty and vicious kings capriciously suppressed both the commoners and philosophers of the classical powers during the age. While such depictions accurately represent the early years of the glorious revolution, after noble arcanists and their conspirators laid claim to the thrones of the deposed godheads, the image of the Arcane Age as the politically backward and despotic age misrepresents what ultimately must be regarded as the ardent dawn of self-governance in world history. Footnote 18. At the risk of indulging in historiography or literary criticism, what most historians of the Arcane Age neglect to consider is that the most despotic societies are always already pregnant with the democratic ideals and the personal aspirations of the oppressed. Popular histories of the Arcane Age neatly fantasize divisions between the characters and events in world history as opposing forces of good and evil, because it's a much simpler narrative to craft for dramatic effect and a much simpler world for the reader to grasp. In truth, history rarely presents such sureties as those present during the Second Great War. End footnote. The typical representation of arcane societies paints the picture of a world oppressed by despotic or monarchical governments, as if after deposing the godheads, smaller fiefdoms ruled by more petty and vicious kings capriciously suppressed both the commoners and philosophers of the classical powers during the age. While such depictions accurately represent the early years of the glorious revolution, after noble arcanists and their conspirators laid claim to the thrones of the deposed godheads, The image of the Arcane Age as a politically backward and despotic age misrepresents what ultimately must be regarded as the ardent dawn of self-governance in world history. By way of a digression, we arrive at the quandary that confronted Sidra many millenniums ago. In the Provenance, very rarely do we discover clearly heroes and villains. Possessing as many facets as the most precious jewel, arcane society made possible a profoundly multicultural world, bound by nothing more than the vague notion of the common weal, and the customs of mixing together in our world's first social democracy. And this concludes Chapter 8 of Arcane Cage.